Welcome to Becoming a Ripple of Faith. This is this year's theme, and I really like the theme of becoming a ripple because oftentimes we think that if we answer God's call, we have to become somebody like Mother Teresa. And that actually is not the truth. What we really need to do is we need to open our heart and our mind to be able to hear God's and the Holy Spirit's guidance. Now, what happens with this when we follow those ripples, we not only change ourselves, but we change our family and friends. And who knows how far that love, that compassion, that caring will go ahead and move out into society. So, for today, this first session is on fear and how fear can make you sick. What's the difference between true fear and false fear? And how is it that that fear ties into us being created in God's image and answering and listening to the Holy Spirit's guidance? So what you can do is you can just simply watch this video. I really would strongly suggest that you also go and listen to the TED Talk that I talk about. The other piece that you can also do is if you are interested in talking about what happens in this video and how it relates to your own life, we are going to have a Zoom discussion next Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m. And all you need to do is to email me so that you can get that Zoom invitation. So let's get started. All right, today we are talking about how fear can make us sick, and we're talking about the difference between true fear and false fear, and then how this all ties into becoming a ripple of faith. Before we start, I want to talk a little bit about how we are created in God's image, and this ties in very directly to what we're going to be talking about with fear. In 2 Corinthians, it says that we are all being transformed into God's image in one degree or another, and that it is the Lord who is the Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one that is doing this. So most all of our major mainline religions believe that we are created in God's image. And Jesus is the one that totally kind of shows us how that works together, because we believe that Jesus is totally divine and totally human. So if Jesus is our model and we are created in God's image, we are also human and divine. Many theologians are saying that our transformation or our spiritual growth or development lies in rediscovering that who we really are is our divinity or our connection with one another in God. So, our humanness consists of our body, our ego, and our cognitive mind. This is sometimes called our small self, our controlling, or our protecting self. And we'll take a look at this a little bit further in the presentation here today. But this is the part of ourself that is concerned with the decision making. It's where fear and judgment lie, where issues of power and control are, and where protection is. This is that kind of constant chatter that goes on in your mind all the time. Well, you better not eat that because you know darn well that's going to make you sick. If you go ahead and do this, this and this is going to happen. That constant chatter, or you know what, it's about time you better figure out what you're going to be making for supper. This is all happening on the left side of our brains. Now, our soul or our spirit, some people call it our intuition, is known as either our true self, as the God within, as the Holy Spirit in us, the higher power. And this is what our true essence really is. It never dies. Our soul never dies. And it is always got positive, high energy vibration, and it's very light. This is our right brain. This is what happens in our right brain. Now, our right and our left brain are definitely connected. So don't start thinking, either or here. We need both sides of our brain. But oftentimes we ignore our right side of our brain, the side of our brain when we get God's guidance and our intuition. And the way to access that right brain and our true self happens by shutting down chatter and by connecting to God in silence. And we will do some more talking about how do we get here to deal with some of this in the next video. But it is in that quiet, silent space that we get the guidance. And that guidance will always be loving and compassionate, and it will always be for the highest good of everyone. It may not be easy, all right, but it will be in the highest good for absolutely everyone. So here's the big question. Are you a body with a soul, or are you a soul within a body? Now, again, this is not an either or question. We are both and. But do you basically see yourself as only the human body with the constant chatter of your left brain? Or do you also see that maybe your true self is your right brain, your connection to God, your intuition, and that you are actually who that is who you really are. And you're just living out a life in this body, in this world, trying to listen to do God's will. So, how you answer this question really has a big impact on your life. And many people don't even ask the question, let alone think hard on what that may actually mean. Now, one of the best TED Talk interviews I have ever seen came from Jill Taylor, and it was called My Stroke of Insight. It is still on TED.com. I strongly suggest that you watch this because this has one of the best ways of showing you how your left and right brain work. Now, Jill is a brain scientist, and she ended up having a massive stroke, which she was able to watch and document as her brain function shut down, and how all of that moved and how the left and right side of the brain communicated together. So it is one of the best things that I have ever seen that explains this in a way that, people would see this as more of a concrete scientific way to take a look at that. Now, before this scares you off because it may sound like too intense or whatever, Jill is extremely funny. And she is very, very good at relating things to people. So what I'm asking you to do is to go to TED.com and then just search for My Stroke of Insight or search for Jill Bolt Taylor, and you will get it. It's one of the highest watched TED Talks around. Okay, we're going to just leave that image of God a little bit, but it will come back and tie in here. And we're going to start talking about how fear makes you sick. So most of this information that I am getting is coming from the book, The Fear Cure by Dr. Lissa Rankin. And she is a medical doctor. She is a very spiritual based person. So she ties in a lot of faith. And so I actually really enjoyed her book. But she starts out by talking about how fear actually makes us sick. And it is definitely researched. We've done a lot of research on fear and stress. But anytime that you have any kind of a fearful thought or an anxious memory, what happens is these hormones flood your body that actually are disease inducing. So oftentimes people will say, well, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not afraid of heights. No, I'm not afraid of that. When we're talking about fear here, we're talking about stress. That's a pretty common word. And that stress is either the fear, anxiety, and worry. And we call it stress because it sounds better. Um, Many people, wear stress as a badge of honor. I'm so busy, I'm so stressed, I'm just overwhelmed. Well, what happens is that stress triggers physical responses that make us sick. We've all heard of the fight or flight response. And stress responses are actually set up to be adaptive and protective when your life is really in danger. So if all of a sudden you're being chased by a dog that's going to absolutely eat you alive, you think, your body goes into a response where it doesn't take care of your digestion and all of that. It's putting everything into making you run faster. And that's what those stress responses are. But what happens is that we're not designed to be frightened very often. Our body really, it wasn't made to withstand the effects of chronic fear and stress. And that's why we are getting disease. That's why we are getting sick. So what happens is we are running on overdrive much of the time, and much of the fears that we have are not real fears. They're false fears, they're imagined fears, and they may happen even without us even knowing it. You may not even remember why you feel afraid. All right. You may not have remembered that you were a young kid being chased by a German Shepherd. And now, whenever you see a German Shepherd, you start to get fearful and scared. You may not even understand that, but that's what's in your body. That's what's in your system. And unless you do something to counteract that, which we can, we just have to do it and make an intention to do that. That kind of stress will turn around and continue to make you sick. So here's some of the scientific proof. Heart disease, heart attacks, death. There's strong, strong evidence that anxiety, fear, panic disorders, any of those types of things, which we would consider stress, I mean, they even call it stress tests, affect our heart. But fear and anxiety can also weaken our immune systems, which means that we'll get colds and things like that more easily, or pick up, other viruses. And this also can affect cancer. There's no solid research that says stress, fear, and anxiety causes cancer, but it does affect the immune system, which in turn can affect cancer. Oh, this is the one that I just love. Stress hormones, cortisol. Cortisol causes, overweight, causes even obesity that they have found. Which I think is very interesting when you talk about how everybody talks about the weight gain of COVID and the pandemic, and because we're eating and we're not moving as much and we're not doing that. Well, sometimes that is true, but also on top of that, the stress of living during a pandemic also has a tendency to increase cortisol rates. We all know stress responses, people that we know that have been in stress for a long period of time, it affects the aging process. People will start to look older. And what happens too sometimes, and people, just kind of blow it off or think they've physically hurt themselves, but our body always usually whispers. Stress can get stuck in different places that can be different for different people. Some people may have backaches or headaches or can't sleep, eye strain. Fatigue, that's kind of a big one. Sometimes people are fatigued and they don't know why, and it's partially stress. And of course, all of your GI and gut disorders definitely, happen because of stress as well. So here are some signs that you have way too many stress hormones. Shouldn't be new to you. Maybe you're not sleeping well. Or if you are sleeping well, you're still tired. Could be that you're gaining weight even when you eat well and you exercise. You catch colds and other infections easily. You feel dizzy for no good reason. That one I thought was interesting. You experience backaches or you have headaches. Your stomach acts up. You feel anxious. Everybody knows what that anxious kind of feeling feels like. Or you may feel blue. You may just feel kind of down and there's maybe no real good reason. But that is some signs, and there's many more signs of the fact that stress is affecting you. I can't remember what the number of doctor's visits that are basically related to stress, but most of the doctor's visits that people have are related more to stress than anything else. So, the other thing that causes stress are feeling states, such as loneliness, or if there's work stress, or pessimism, fear, depression, and anxiety. All trigger stress responses. So, take a look at the pandemic. I don't know one person in our societies right now that aren't dealing with stress responses. Now, this is what's interesting. Positive belief, loving connection, creative expression, gathering together in a spiritual community, even if it is on Zoom, meditation, prayer, being out in nature, all can elicit relaxation responses. All of those things will move you more into your right brain and help trigger and loosen that stress response. So when our mind shifts from fear to love, the body can heal. And when you shift from fear to love, you're listening to your intuition, the Holy Spirit, your right brain. And that's when God can guide you to do His will. And then you can become a ripple of God's love. You cannot do that out of being a fear-based approach. And we'll look at that a little bit more as we go on. So we have true fear and we have false fear. And most of the fears that we have are not true fears. They're fears in our imagination. They're really no real threats. But the problem is that the brain can't tell the difference. So you get the stress responses. A good example of this would be, as hard as it is to hear, our recent election. That was not true fear. Being afraid of the fact that your candidate would not win is really not a true fear. It was a false fear because you really have no idea, whichever way it went, what was going to happen. It's that whole uncertainty that's out there. So that's one way to take a look at whether it is a true or false fear. But we all experience both true and false fear. And both of those fears can help us. When we identify what our fear is, then we can go ahead and make some changes in our behaviors. So what is true fear really? True fear is that kind of fear that triggers a necessarily stress response, and it's there to protect you or protect someone else. This is a fear that's meant to keep you safe, and it always demands an action. Sometimes you won't even know that you are afraid. For example, you see a toddler going over to somebody's swimming pool and about to fall in, and you know that child doesn't know how to swim. Okay, that's a true fear, and you react and you go and you grab that kid and you pull that kid out. That would be considered a true fear. You're driving and somebody swerves into you and you move out of the way, or you slam on your brakes, or your car slams on its brakes. That is basically a true fear. It's there to protect you and to keep you safe. Now, sometimes those true fears are not as, concrete, because they can come out of your intuition or God giving you guidance. And when it's a true fear, you just again know that you need to react. You need to do some kind of action. This happened to me when I was in college, and I went to Augsburg College, and because parking was so terrible, I would get there really early in the morning. I would park and I would go out for a run, and then I'd come back to the gym, shower, and get ready for classes for the day. So I had gone out and done that. And of course, when you do that and you're not living on campus, you do not get any of the communication at all. I mean, this was long before we were doing texting. So I was out running, and all of a sudden I had that true fear gut instinct. It was like, there's something wrong. I looked over my right shoulder, and here was a guy in a trench coat, um, and dress shoes, and he was coming towards me fairly fast. I switched across the road and started to run as fast as I could. I looked back over my left shoulder, and this guy was running after me. I took off. I didn't even know where I was going. I actually ran far enough that I got lost. By the time I got back to Augsburg and got into the gym, there were signs all over the place saying, do not run. You know, there's been several rapes. There's a rapist that hasn't been caught. So that would be an example of a kind of intuitive, God guided, true fear type of hit. Most of our fears are false fears. And false fears exist in your imagination. You're making up stories in your mind of what could happen. And we all do this because we worry about things that never come about. So, what happens is that they start to spiral along unconsciously. Sometimes you don't even know it, and you think it is the truth, but oftentimes it is not. So, some of the emotions that get attached to false fear: anger, resentment, revenge, hatred, intolerance, depression, anxiety, and unresolved grief. Grief is a normal, natural process, but unresolved grief is a grief that stays and stays there and gets stuck. So, false fears are the ones that keep you in a stress response, and they cause unnecessary suffering, and they don't keep you safe. I mean, we know this. How many times have we worried about things that don't happen? So, practicing tragedy in our mind does not keep us safe. But you can't solve a problem creatively or in your best interest if you are stuck in the false fear, if you're stuck in that left brain. So, what you need to do is you need to calm down your nervous system to reboot. And again, in the next video, that's where we will be talking about how can we use the fear to cure us. So, how do you discern? How do you decide? Learning to discern between true fear and false fear allows you to know which of those voices in your head can you trust to guide your decisions. Healthy decisions that guide appropriate behaviors never come from false fear. They are never coming from that scared, anxious, revengeful area. They always arise from God, which would be right brained, more intuition, and your own integrity. So now we're going back to when we talked earlier about our small self, our in the image of God. Now, our small self, our left brain, our fearful self, our protective self, that's the voice that's the loudest when fear is running the show. It talks to you all of the time. That's the one that is saying, you know what, this cannot be. This is not supposed to be happening. And you know what? This person needs to change, or this needs to happen and change. It can be very childish, this left side of our brain, but it's hurt and it's scared and it's insecure. It can be overprotective and very self-absorbed, but it always seeks approval. It is very judgmental, and it hates change. It hates change. So this small self has very strong ideas about what's right, what's wrong, what's real, and what's possible. All right. This political side is right. This other political side is wrong. This way to worship God is the only right way to worship God. If you do that, then you're not a Christian. What's real? What's possible? It's small self really, really does not like things that aren't certain. They have to have certain answers. And we all know that. We feel better when we're sure we know what's right, what's wrong, what's certain, and that this is the answer. Now, everything that happens in modern society feeds the small self. Just take a look at our society. Just take a look how we approach things. Um, we see things very dualistically. We see things very much either or. We see things as this is certain. So what happens is if you don't want to feed your small self, if you want to feed your God self, your true self, you have to pay less attention to what the world is doing and saying. So our small self is limiting our own beliefs and also our world view. And we will take a look at that in the next video more so. If you ignore your small self, it isn't going to help. That isn't going to help you. You can't just ignore it. And your small self, your ego, also provides some very good things. But you don't have to let those fears control you. And that's what we will be looking at. So your true self, that's that core that is in you, your soul, your spirit, your God self, the God within. That's where the birthplace of true courage comes. And it shows up as intuition or God's voice. And it can always be trusted to guide your actions. Now, this right brain, true God self may dim, it may get smaller, but it will never go out. So when people say that they've lost their faith or they don't have any faith or that they don't believe that there's God, that dimness means that they're letting false fears run their life. They're letting their left brain run their life. So the problem, however, is that your right brain, your inner truth, may not correspond with society's rules and may not correspond to looking at things in an either or fashion or revenge or climbing the ladder or you got to get out there and get what you want at everybody else's expense. But the inner truth will lead you to decisions that are aligned not only with your truth, your soul's values, but it will be aligned with God's calling for you. You can tell if you're listening to your true self, if it feels good. And feeling good, it's a deep kind of soul food for fulfillment. It's not maybe easy, but you just know that it is the right thing and it feels good because you're showing respect for yourself and also for others. So every time that you betray that God self, that true self, a little piece of you has a tendency to wither away. And when that withers away, that's when that fear can take your health and your vitality and your happiness. Today, we took a look at how fear can make us sick. And we took a look at the difference between true fear and false fear. And then how these concepts relate to being created in God's image and how that affects us being a ripple of faith. Now, again, if you'd like to discuss this further and discuss how this relates to your life a little bit more, make sure that you sign up with me for the Zoom meeting on Tuesday night, this next Tuesday night. So the next video, we will be taking a look at ways of how we can deal with false fear and how we can connect with God and our true self so that we do not get caught in those stress responses that are making us sick. So thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again.